So today is lesson 6, and if you are just watching the lesson video, our first activity in the lesson 6 folder is our portfolio gallery. So there's a discussion board thread, and I'm asking you to post the link to your portfolio, as well as you have a chance to review your classmates' submissions, and you can provide them some feedback. Hey, here's what I really liked about your portfolio, or I have an idea or a suggestion of how you might make it better. So some constructive and respectful feedback probably is useful as well. Okay, so I'll encourage everybody to post your links. I will start marking these. I should have them marked by next week's class. So next week is our last class before reading week. There is no exam. I believe we will have, I'll just check. I think there will be a quiz. No, actually not. So there's nothing, you guys can kind of relax. No homework or assignments due over reading week. Okay, so post your gallery links. I'll get them marked and back to you. Okay, so what we want to do, let's open up our job tracker from last week. So we want to open up your code editor and use your nodemon command to get it running. As you can see, I've already started mine. Morning, Matt. To start up your project, I've made a little bit of an adjustment here to some of the CSS to improve the formatting. I think we left it looking like this last week. So I had the bootstrap cards and they were stacked vertically. We actually want them to appear like this. So in our employer's index HBS, our layout file, we want to make going to add a few more, couple other elements and class definitions to change this formatting into this formatting. And this was the last file we were working on last week. Here was the file. So it was under views, employers, it was the index.hbs. And this, if we're looking at the HTML, this is how we left it at the end of last week. So we used the hashtag each loop. So this was our handlebar loop syntax, and we created a card that was 4 columns wide. When we did that, this is how it looked. So we'll want to just tweak the HTML a little bit, clean it up so it looks like this instead. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to wrap this entire thing in a section tag with a class using a bootstrap class of row. I'm going to add this section class equals row. And I'm going to move that loop inside. I'll go back and refresh the changes. We can see what this does. Okay, so that will put them horizontally across the page. And because we've used call for and our bootstrap grid system is 12 columns wide, if we add another employer, it will now appear down below. So we've got 3 columns. I also want to center the text and add a little bit of margin so that our cards are not, our card edges are not nesting right up against each other. Excuse me. Okay, so in here, I'm actually going to change this that each card is 3 columns wide, and we're going to add a margin of 2. So M will be a margin on all sides. So I'll try that. So that gives us a little bit of margin. And then I'm going to, in here, I want to make my cards a little taller, and I also want to center the text in them. So inside the card body, where we've got card body, I'll add text center, page 100. You don't have to follow these classes. I mean, this is really just me playing around with it, trying to make it look a little more like I want it to look. So you can either ignore this entirely, or you can make other choices in terms of the layout. So now it should look like this. And there's our HTML. Let's do one other simple thing in terms of styling, which is let's go and find a font we like and override the default let's override the default font and also add a little bit of a margin or padding to our main section so that this title gets lowered a little bit, very close to the header, which I don't love. So for that, let's jump over to fonts.google.com. And let's go pick a font you like. Pick anything you want. We don't have to pick the same one. I think I like this one. I'm going to click on this Mukta or Mukta. And I think I like this weight, light 300. So I'm just going to select this style. And then it gives me some links that we can paste in to our layout file. So I'm just going to copy that section over here on the right after I've selected a font I like. I'll go to layout and I'll add a new section here for Google Fonts, and I'll just paste in so I'm linking to the Google font. Morning, Mike. And then I have one more step. If I go back and refresh my site, that font won't be active yet. And it's still giving me the default Bootstrap font. So it gives me here these CSS rules. So I'm going to copy this first one, this font family Mukto Sans Serif. I'm going to copy that down at the very bottom under this CSS rules to specify families. And then in our style sheet, I'm going to change and I'm going to take out the default Lucinda Grand style definition. So this, if I refresh my font now, so now I get this Google font, which I like better. So I just went to fonts.google.com, clicked on a font that I liked. I copied the 3 link tags into the layout from this section, And then I just copied the font family rule and put that into my body tag in the style sheet that the Express generator built for us. So now my site looks a little better. And then I'm going to add a little padding to the main tag. So we've got main class of container. So I'm also going to add here, so main. We'll set a top margin of, I don't know, maybe 25 pixels. This should shift our page headings down a little bit so they're not quite so close to the bottom of our navigation bar. Now that looks good. 25 pixels, I think, is about right. Okay, I won't get too carried away with the design in CSS. I just like to make it look not quite so much like Bootstrap template. Okay, anybody have any questions or problems so far making your changes?
So the Bootstrap and the Google fonts, I don't think the Google fonts seem to be working. Can you please show me the layout coding?
Sure.
The Bootstrap and
So
Google
in
fonts?
the layout, so I've copied those 3 links that I got from Google Fonts. Okay.
Okay.
So once you select a font, Chris, on Google Fonts, it has this section here on the bottom right. Right? It says use on the web to embed a font, copy the code. So this is the code that I copied into the header of the layout file.
Okay.
So that's step 1, is to add those links. And step 2, yeah, you could use the import. Colton, just because my CSS knowledge is rusty and I don't use import very much. Yeah, absolutely. You could just import it into the style sheet instead. That's fine. Either or. The Google Font site, it gives you both options. So if you want to just import, you can do that too. And then, Chris, in the styles.css that lives inside of our public style sheets, so this file was created for us automatically by the Express generator. We didn't make this style sheet. I've changed the font family based on the rule that the Google Font page gives me. Okay, so that will change the default font for all the text.
Yeah, but I still don't notice a difference for some reason.
Reload your page without your cache. Sometimes your browser might cache your CSS, which means it might not be loading the latest version of your CSS.
That's odd. Wait.
Okay, I'm happy to look at it with you after. If it's not working right now, don't stress too much. We can sort it out later. Not critical if your site is working.
Okay.
So we've got one method in view where we can interact with our database. But we also should address our database connection. The way we set up our database connection last week, it's functional, but we sort of did it a quick and dirty way by hard coding. We've hard coded our connection string right into our app.js file. So this is somewhat problematic for a couple of reasons. One, we should never have these values in our application code, number one. Number two is we might want to use a different database when we're working locally or when our application is in production. Now that's not the case for us. We're just going to use our live database. But what I want to do is move this database connection out into a separate configuration file. And that way we have the ability to use different databases if we want for development and in production. So Node has a particular setup for storing these kinds of variables. That it uses what are called environment files. They're not specific to Node. You'll see when we're working with things like Angular, or if you work with React, most JavaScript libraries or frameworks use some kind of environment file to store things like database connections or API keys. We don't want them right in our application code. So we're going to, in order to use an environment file, we're going to install an npm package. Small package that's called .env. So what this allows us to do, it's a zero dependency module. It lets us load environment variables, so global variables like a database connection, from a .env file. And then we can access it with this process.env object. So this will allow us to use different values if we want, both live and locally, and it keeps our database connection out of our application code. It even keeps it out of our Git repository. So the end files are ignored in Git. So things like your API keys and your database connections don't wind up on GitHub. So we're going to install this package, then we're going to create a .env file, and then we're going to use that package to read the connection string from our environment file instead of having it hard-coded. So first, we need to open our terminal. And I'll just make a new, click on new, I'll make a new terminal because my app is running. And I want to run the command npm i.env. D-O-T-E-N-V. So let's install that package. I'll put it in the chat as well, npm i.env. Then we're going to create an environment file. We're going to move our connection string to that file, and then we're going to rewrite some of this code. So when we try to connect to the database, we are reading the connection string from that environment file. So up in my root folder here now, I'm going to make a new file, which I will call .env. And typically in environment files, the global variables, by convention, we typically use all caps for the variable names. I'll create one called database URL equals, and for the moment, I'll just put it in as an empty string. All right, so there's my simple file so far. Just says database underscore URL equals, and a set of empty double quotes. We're going to go back to app.js. I'm going to cut my connection string, this whole thing. I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to remove it. I'm going to go to my .env and paste it in here. And notice, So I don't have any single quotes here. So we're moving that connection string into our environment file. So this is not absolutely required, but it's recommended. If we're going to work with Node, then I think it's important that we do it the right way and that we understand what an environment file is and how we use it. Later on, we'll add things like API keys for third-party login. So we'll store those IDs and secrets in the environment file as well. We don't want to hard code them into our application code. Okay, so your .env file should look like mine. The only differences will be you'll have your username, your password, your server name, and your database name. So once I save this change, my app is going to now when I save it, our connection fails because we no longer have a connection string in our app.js. So every time the app restarts, it's trying to connect to MongoDB. Well, this fails now. So this behavior, this is okay. This is to be expected. So now we need to rewrite a little bit of this code. So I'm going to put this before our connection. Not in production mode. Use.env file db connection string. So I'm going to put this above the database connection line. So we'll say if our process.env, so this is our environment, and this often has a variable for the environment. If it is not production, then we're going to use use the environment file when we're not in production mode. And now I'm going to replace this connection string by reading it from our process.env variable. So I'm going to take out those double quotes that are there. So we're trying to read the database URL variable from our environment file. Okay, so I've added this block on line 15, 16, 17, and I'm changing where the connection string comes from. I'll save my changes and see if my app connects now. So now I save my changes, and once again, it says I'm connected. So we've moved that database connection out of app.js, and it now lives inside this environment file. If I go back to the browser and refresh, we should still be able to see the list of employers. So my database connection and query, it's still running. Even after I've made these changes. So again, this section is new. And line 23 has been modified. So this is working fine in my development environment on my machine. Let's look at what happens though when I try to now push this to GitHub and redeploy my site to Heroku. So go back to my other terminal window here. going to add my files and make a new commit. I move db to .env. And I'm going to push my files. So I'll go have a look in my repository now. So here's my job tracker, which I just updated. Now you notice the .env file is not in my repository. So when we go to app.js, right, it's looking for the database connection in the .env file. How come the .env file isn't here? I have it in my local project. And it's right here. Or if I go and open up this project, if I open it in Windows, so here's the .env file, it's right here. Tanya, you got it, absolutely, right? We used the git ignore file for Node that I posted on Blackboard, linked to it. And one of the things, so not only does it exclude Node modules, but it also excludes any environment files. So let me go to Heroku and try this out now. So now when I load my job tracker on Heroku, the home page and about page, those work. But when I click on employers, notice it's not loading, it's hanging because Heroku doesn't know where to find that database connection. Right? My .env file, it's not here. So this is going to eventually time out. Yeah, and just give me this is kind of the general Heroku error page. I could go and look at my logs. I'm going to just log into the dashboard. So this behavior is by design. Just have to sign authenticator. So let's see what happened. I'll go to my job tracker. I think if I look in the activity, I may be able to see okay, well, we'll skip that part for now. But, oh, view logs under more. I click this more button and view logs. And it says, I got a request timeout at the path get employers. So when it tries to load, that times out because my database connection isn't there. So how do we fix this? Where do we put our database connection on Heroku? I will show you. In the settings, so if you go into Heroku and in the settings, there's a section here called config vars. They change the way the app behaves and we can create our own. So I'm going to click on reveal config vars and it says, okay, there aren't any. So what it gives us is it gives me two text boxes, one with a key and one with a value. So I can add my database connection in the Heroku dashboard. So when my app is running live, it's not reading the configuration values from my environment file or from my app.js. It actually pulls them directly from the Heroku dashboard. Okay, so I'll show you again how I got here. I clicked on my app in the dashboard, and then I clicked on settings. And then in the config vars section, I clicked this reveal config vars section. So I'm going to use the key database_URL because that's what our code is looking for, an environment variable called database URL. And then I'll go to my end file and I'm going to copy my database connection. I don't think we need the quotes here. So I'm going to paste in my database connection. So this way, if I wanted, when I'm working locally, I could use a local database in my environment file, and on Heroku, I just put in the live database, and I will add. I'm going to add one other variable here. Well, actually, let's see if that works now. That should fix my error. I'm going to go back and refresh now. And now my site, my employers load pretty much right away. So later on, when we want to do something like GitHub login or Google login, we're going to have API keys. We will add those in the config vars section on Heroku, and we'll add them into our environment file locally. So this allows us to run our application with different settings in a development environment and in the production environment. And it keeps those values, those sensitive values like a database connection or an API secret, keeps them out of our Git repository if we put them in the .env file. So this is the recommended way to manage those sensitive application or configuration variables through the use of an environment file and through the use of the application configuration variables. Now, we didn't really use these when we worked with ASP.NET. Microsoft actually has a very similar system. We just put things like our database connection, our API keys in our app settings.json. That's not actually recommended. Microsoft uses something called the secret key vault locally, and in Azure, it also had this like a configuration settings. It was just a lot more cumbersome and time consuming, so we didn't use it. I kind of skipped over it last semester in working with Microsoft, but I did want to show you the environment file and how we can set these variables up globally in our hosting dashboard. This is also better for me because if I go and look at my commits from last week, what was happening was, so here was my code at the end of last week. So I was in order to get my site to run, I had to publish my app.js, and GitHub has a security tracker that every day was emailing me security warnings saying, you've put a database connection, it recognizes this code, and it was telling me that I've published my username and password into my public repository and every day warning me. So I'm not going to get those warnings anymore because my code no longer contains, my code on GitHub, it no longer contains those credentials. We're using the environment file locally and the website hosting configuration settings. So that sensitive data is not on GitHub. And GitHub tells you you really shouldn't put it here. Does anybody have questions about using the environment file and the config variables in the hosting panel?
Yeah, I think I understand it.
Okay.
So to publish, all I have to do is push.
The commands would be add, commit,
Okay.
push.
Add, push,
Add first, commit
then
is
push.
second, no, push is third. You must add,
Add,
commit,
commit,
push.
push. Nope.
Okay, if you need a reference for the commands, you can find it on Blackboard under Weekly Learning and Tools and Resources.
Okay.
Got all the commands with the syntax that you need, so you can use that as a reference. The next feature we want to add to this is the ability to add new employers directly through our node site. These employers, you may recall last week, we just opened up the MongoDB control panel on the website and we manually created these documents. So what we want to do is add a link here to add a new employer, and then we'll want a form, and we'll need both a get and a post method. A get method so we can display a new employer form, and a post method so when the user completes it and submits it, we can add the employer to MongoDB, and then we can bring the user back to the employer index and we will see a new Bootstrap card. So we'll start this process. Let's add an employer link. So in our employers index, underneath our title, we'll add a link that goes to employers/create. And it'll just say add a new employer. And maybe we'll even make that a button, give it a class. We'll make it gray, I think. Gray button with white. And then we can start to create a simple view. The view is just going to be HTML. There's not going to be any real handlebars code on it. I'm just going to make a simple form where we can add an employer name. And I think the other fields we had last week were, so we want 4 inputs: a name, a location, a description, so we could use a text area, and a website. So just 3 regular inputs and 1 text area. And we were going to make the name and the location required, and I think the URL and the description were optional. And so we can create this pretty quickly. So under views and employers, we'll make a new Hbs file, so a new view template. So I'll right-click my employers folder. I'm going to make a new file here, and I'll just call it create.hbs. And we'll just get a blank. Sorry, I lied. We're going to have 1 dynamic value, which would just be the title. And we can create a simple form. This is just HTML. We'll set our method as post. We'll actually leave out the form action. When we're working in Node and Express, forms typically post to the same URL. So we don't have to specify, like in PHP, we'd usually have like a create page and save page. And the create page in the form, we'd use action equals, save page.php. We don't really need that, and we'll see why. So we'll just create some simple field sets. So we'll have a name input. We'll have a location. Oh, I guess I should use 4 equals. Add another field set on, but this one I'm going to change the input to a text area. Which are not self-closing. So this will be description. And I'll take out the star here because our description's optional. And our last field set will be for the URL, which is also optional. What did we call it? Let's just, yeah, we called it website. So I'll call my input website. It's not required. Our type can be URL. And again, we don't need a star. There's only a star besides name and location, because the first 2 fields are required and the 3rd and 4th field are optional. And then I'll just add on a button down at the bottom. It just says save. I think this should be sufficient for our form. I mean, there shouldn't really be anything new here. This is just a basic HTML form pretty much. So I'll go back now and click my add a new employer button, and we can see how our form looks. So I'll click, and we get 404. How come? It's calling employers create. We have a view called employers create. So why a 404 response here? I realize we're approaching 10. We will take a break shortly. I've put all the HTML, all the content of this view in the chat for you already. Why does this give a 404 error when we click that add a new employer button? Aha, Mike, very good. Right, we have not set up any kind of root handler in the employer's controller. So we have a view, but we don't have a method that reads a GET request at this URL and tells Node to load our employer's create view. So we'll do that quickly. We'll go to the employer's controller. We'll add a simple method to load the view, and then we'll take a break. So under controllers, I'm going to open up employers. So here's our root get that loads our index. So this is going to be at, here's the URL, employers/create. Load empty employer form. So when we have from our router a GET request at employers/create, we'll use our usual express callback with our request and response parameters. So all we're going to do is render the employer create view, pass in some title, whatever title you want to appear at the top of the page inside that H1. So I'll maybe use a title of employer detail. So if I go back and refresh, our form should get displayed now. Go back to employers, click add, and we get our simple okay, so we've added a link that calls a URL. We're handling the URL in the controller. We're saying which view we want to render and passing it a title. So now that title also shows up in my browser tab as well as within the H1. One last thing I'm going to do, because it's going to bother me if I don't, is want to add a bit of some margins to these field sets so they're not jammed up together. So I'm just going to go to my style sheet and add a margin to the field set definition. Then I'll push all my code to Git and we will take a well-deserved break. So in styles, I'm going to add to the field set tag, maybe try a 5-pixel margin on all sides. See how that works. That's okay. Maybe even a little bigger. Maybe I'll make my margin 10 pixels. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay, so we can start to browse around. We can see our employers. And when we click add, we get our form. What do you think will happen? Actually, you know what? I'll just take a break here. I'll stop. It's 9:57. A lot of you were up late last night. Okay, I'm going to push everything we've done so far up to GitHub. So it's all there. So I'm going to run git add dot git commit -m, so it's lesson 6.2 create employer form and git push. Okay, so if you're a bit behind, if you're missing anything, you can compare it to my code on GitHub. I'm going to step away for a few minutes. We will resume at 10:10. Okay? Actually, 10:08. because I've got a meeting right at 11 and I want to make the most of the time we have. So we'll come back in 10 minutes.